And we'll also be sending out this week for the interns an evaluation of the PILI program. Fellow who hasn't completed their second half yet, just I want to just remind people that the intern and fellow reception and we have invited your advisors already and have online by Wednesday if you can, so we can just get a good head registered right now. So it should be a good group. And then reminder that Race Judicata 5K is on Thursday, September 4th. Or you can stop by the PILI tents. We are alumni and get some refreshments. So I encourage you guys to stop by the tent if you are, circle around. It's a great mingling, networking opportunity. Also want to welcome officially our guest that we have here, the Illinois Supreme Court Justice. And I just want to thank you guys for being here today and recognizing the important work that the interns have. And we're just kind of getting this worked out here. I want to welcome today's speaker. The session today is entitled 50th Anniversary of the Since it's such a it's a spotlight on the Shriver Center and current anti-poverty. Just as a resource in the public interest law. A lot of direct service piece of it, kind of the scope of public interest law.
Work with Justice Kilbride really as an advocate. He understands the first people that I met when I made a transition from litigation over to the Shriver Center and advocacy, and really one of the folks who made me proud about that switch, and his family. I'm going to ask folks to move down. I'm old school. You can't sit in the back row. Small group, and we can have some dialogue. So if you're in that very back row, I'd ask you. Before I get started, well, no, if you're, I'm talking about the very back row. They know who they are. And they can move up. The other, you're fine if everybody else is fine. It's okay. So I'm going to first just ask a question. How many of you studied the war on poverty when you were school and undergrad? One person, two people raised their hand. And for those watching and can't see the audience, we've got about 20 people here. Out of 20. That's very interesting. Now, what did you learn about the war on poverty? So herein lies one of our problems. We have two people out of this room who know anything about the war on poverty. And Our challenge as advocates in this area is to bring the message forward. It doesn't have to be a repeat of the initial one. We need to bring the message forward. And just to summarize, the War on Poverty was headed by Sergeant Schreiber. Our organization was reluctantly recruited to that. And he had done work on the Peace Corps. He had really been seen as an advocate, but not a political sort of. To run the War on Poverty was really a challenge for him. And if you look at the memoirs from that period, he didn't want to do it. You know, he was called to service by his country to do it. He accepted the challenge. So when we think of the War on Poverty, we're thinking about 1904, and we're thinking about at that time, people did not understand the degree of poverty. Time magazine photo, and I don't have it with me, where there's a little girl obviously living in poor conditions. That was published. It literally changed the face of poverty. Now I know Justice Kilbride didn't raise his hand because he was being generous. Remember that period in terms of change and people actually recognizing poverty. So it's important just to think about it in that context. You can change a conversation. You actually can change how we look at something when there's a concerted effort to do. That's what this was about. So other things associated with the War on Poverty include Head Start, other anti-poverty programs, where folks who were struggling actually could so just out of curiosity, how many of you have been to another War on Poverty event since this has been? But a lot of organizations have been recognizing it. So it is important to bring it forward. So first talk about the Schreiber Center. If you're not familiar with us, we do work across healthcare, education, women, law and policy, housing, economic justice, budget and tax, community justice, and asset. What asset opportunity is, so I'll explain that. That's trying to increase savings, retirement savings for individuals who do not have access to traditional work. We have a 401k. If you work at certain kinds of employers, you don't have access to. So increasing ways to save, avoiding some of the pitfalls of predatory lending. It's that whole bucket of items trying to increase awareness and security. Also at the Schreiber Center, National Training Program. We recently launched a Racial Justice Training Institute. It was the first of its kind. The whole focus is trying to increase racial justice. One of my shocks and surprises when I came over to the legal aid side of the street was how little connection there was between the civil rights world and the aid world, even though I should have known that as well since I was on the civil rights side. But it became that's really inconsistent with the War on Poverty. It was explicit that issues of race were going to. It is peculiar. Things have gone into two different sort of streams. They're really connected, and so there's been a lot of work of trying to pull them back together in the racial justice. We also work on affirmative litigation, negotiations, community lawyering. Everybody knows that community lawyering is in this room. Lawyering is the concept of empowering individuals to help represent themselves. So instead of lawyers going into a community and saying, this is what you to be ground up, where you're talking with community members, actually forming the legal therapy, political advocacy, courtroom advocacy, just the whole gamut. Another major component of the war on poverty, if you're familiar with LAF here, Legal Assistance Foundation, those offices actually used to be not downtown, but in neighborhoods. That model for legal services was various reasons, budget and other things. Most LSCs have now moved into sort of is there still, but not probably at the same degree. I have to be a community lawyer. I certainly, in my education equity practice, worked with communities. I had cases in Champaign, Peoria, and Elgin, Illinois. And what that meant is I was always in my car. Those communities to meet with them and talk with them as much as I could to understand what they. I used to play the point person on the legal teams where you have people who do the briefs, you have people that do the litigation, you have people. But that's not necessarily the best model. And one of the things of my frustration of being the person in the community, but I found sometimes there's a reluctance to engage in with the community. Thought of it as, oh, it was hard work, or I just don't feel comfortable. And as I became, really fought and tried to resist. I really encourage all people on our team, all attorneys on our team to have interaction with our team. It truly changes the work. Lawyer team would say, well, that's not what the law does, and that's not what we can do. They don't want this other thing. So go back and tell them we can't get it, because I'm not going to. That pushed the creative process, and we actually were more in line with our community. That I have to tell you, that has made me proud over my career, and I continue to be proud of it. We also do leadership training. We have a Washington. There's executive directors. In business sectors. You know, in Chicago, we have Leadership Chicago, which pulls from all sectors across the board for legal services. So that's something that we're doing. We're also about. We also have the Clearinghouse Review Journal. And this is also part of the war on poverty. There was all across the country, and people really struggled around. I need a brief because I want to copy that case I heard about, right? So it was a brief bank initially. So it was lawyers all across the country sending in their briefs, predecessor to the Clearinghouse Review, and literally they would get requests, and then they would go out and reprint. That grew into the Clearinghouse Review Journal, principal journal for legal services. Your law schools probably have access to it. Membership is like $39 a year, but irrespective of that, I'm pretty sure your law school is a really good resource. There's actually a special issue on racial justice that came out slide for at the end of. So I want to just talk about the 50th anniversary of the war on poverty and then bring it forward, right? So we've been talking about its history. What does it mean today? Well, this is a little bit small, but I'll try to. Okay, so with the 50th anniversary and the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, there was a lot of data that was collected, and people were taking a look back and looking forward. So if you look at the data now in Chicago, the percentage of segregated neighborhoods is actually just gone down by a few percentage points, from 69% to 63% in 50 years. When you look at the poverty rate, it's actually a little bit higher for African Americans, and these are by race, by the way. A little bit higher for African Americans. The median income has dropped a little bit in comparison. But what these statistics are telling us is we've moved forward, but we've also moved backwards, right? And what are we supposed to do about that? So when I'm talking about the 50th anniversary on the war on poverty, to me it's a charge of how can we really fulfill the original mission. Of course things are better. You know, I certainly had a different experience than my mother in terms of my education. My mom was a one-room schoolhouse teacher in Douglas, Georgia. Went to an associate's college, which was really exceptional for an African American of that time. I, of course, did not have those same challenges, or not as many, at least. So we've, of course, made progress, but those statistics tell you we've also not made progress. Cook County foreclosures, the number of foreclosures, you know, is astounding. CPS school closures, when you look at this by race and ethnicity and poverty, the concentrations are, of course, in the lowest income neighborhoods and in the neighborhoods that are people of color. So again, have we made progress? We made some progress, but we've also slipped back. Which leads to the question, are racial justice and poverty, where does that overlap fit, right? So I just want to throw that out there to the audience. How do people think about that? You're working at nonprofits that are working with people who are usually low income. What's your experience been? Is it tied to race or is it not tied to race?
I'm working on a case against the Chicago Police. Precincts and districts that are
Others?
So just in terms of neighborhoods being highly segregated, I taught on the south side of Chicago before. I taught in New York before that, in the Bronx, and I thought that school had very little diversity. Then I got to Chicago, and it was 100% African American.
Yeah, and I don't want to say that a school that is all African American or all Latino can't be a good school, but the research and the data shows that typically the money does not flow to those schools, and the same resources don't flow to those schools. So it is an issue that we have to deal with. Do we think that more racial diversity within our organizations? Well, let me just ask a question. How many of you explicitly deal with race when you're doing work over the summer, when race was an actual explicit factor that you were including? So the Chicago police case?
yeah, we had a seat.
Another hand.
I work at Legal Aid Society and domestic. Our clients are Hispanic. We have a few. Last week, our
That was explicit and then maybe a little bit more contextual as well. Other folks?
At LAF, we have a large disparate impact case.
And is that the school case?
No, it's not the Trumbull case.
Okay.
It's a public housing case.
Okay. So that's about 3 people out of 20. So that's a conundrum, right? We're saying that race and low income cross, and a lot of our work is not explicitly addressing that. So that's an issue, right? So do you think if we, let me ask you this, how many of you feel that you have diversity amongst your staff when you're doing this work? A handful out of the group again. So this is another like wake-up call when I came across the street from civil rights arena, the lack of diversity within the organizations. So do we think there's a connection between the lack of diversity in the organizations and the work that we do? Seeing a couple people nod. Why do you think that?
I mean, I can tell a story. It's not from this summer, but I worked a previous summer at an office. It was on the south side, and the interns were the only white staffers. And I think it actually was a really eye-opening experience for clients, because they would come in, they would get to talk to us, and they'd say, no, I want someone really from this organization. I want someone who's really going to work on my case. And it took some time to build some trust that a Caucasian person could be on their side and could be working for them. And I think that clients having those experiences has been a really important part of within that organization and the organization I'm with. Of the opposing counsel, a lot of the judges are Caucasian, and if you're only willing to trust people who live in your neighborhood and look like you, that causes even more problems beyond the problems they already have in the case.
I'm going to add to that a little bit. So you're talking about folks who are persons of color who may have distrust of a system, including organizations trying to help them when there's not diversity. I would say people feel that way. I can't speak for everybody. I definitely think that's a sentiment. But I also think people are very realistic. And whoever's there to help, they're going to work with them to help, or to accept the help and work with them. So I don't want people leaving here saying, oh, you have to be a person of color to work with a person of color. That is not what I'm trying to communicate. I'm actually talking, and it's a value experience. So if I go into an organization and I'm African American and I only see a sea of white individuals, what does that say to me? Does it say to me I can never achieve to be on the other side of the desk and actually be the lawyer representing somebody or somebody being the policy advocate? It's a very psychological impact when you are continually seeing organizations that don't have representation from your groups. So it is multifaceted, it is complicated, and if you think it does not exist, I guarantee you are wrong. People may not express it because they don't want to bite the hand that feeds them, but it is a struggle that people have. But it doesn't mean you cannot do good work with people who are of a different ilk than you. But what it does mean as an organization is, how do you incorporate race, right? How do you make decisions about how we're going to incorporate race? Because if we're saying 50 years later than the war on poverty, we made some progress but not enough progress, maybe the problem is we haven't dealt with the elephant in the room. And how do you deal with the elephant in the room? Is it by explicitly talking about race in the work that you do? For instance, I talk to a lot of lawyers that do FOIAs all the time, Freedom of Information Act requests. And a lot of people don't ask for race or information disaggregated by race. That's one additional question for your FOIA. And actually may help tell your story about what's going on with your clients. And it's not, either they have the data or they don't have the data, right? But it doesn't hurt to ask. But people don't think to do that in their work. As an organization, does your mission say anything about racial ethnicities, right? Does your intake process deal with anything about race? I looked at a lot of intake forms. That is not a question. You know, you don't collect the data, period. You know, what is the ethnicity of the people calling in? Or you don't ask the question, do you think race actually impacted what happened to you, right, in this particular instance? And there are ways to do that, and I will caution everybody. That's not easy to get those things into documents and to get that into structures. There is a course and a way to do that, and that has to be really thoughtful and deliberate. So I'm not asking people to run back and say, we need to add this question tomorrow. I'm asking people to be thoughtful about it in their organizations. And I also want to just say, just because you have folks of color at your organization doesn't mean you're going to do racial justice work, right? That's not the same thing. Because it's about an organizational shift to make it a priority. It's not necessarily about the individuals, because not everybody has the same background and the same experience. You know, I see that there's a trend in legal services and nonprofit community to have community organizers that look like the people that you're representing. which I think is fine and good, but that does not necessarily mean you have racial justice work going on in your organization. You know, it may be part of a solution, but in some ways it actually can highlight an issue in your organization. If no one is, you know, you have an organization of attorneys and very few persons of color who are attorneys, right? There's some dichotomy there. And I want to just talk about race. You know, the courts have been less willing to engage in explicit race cases. That's certainly been our Supreme Court stand and across the board. But we are getting a lot of really interesting information from implicit bias research. And how many folks have ever gone through an implicit bias training?
We did one here.
Okay. Okay, so let me back up. Anybody else besides the two right here who were in the implicit bias session? In the striped jacket. Yeah, what was your experience in that? Did that make you understand issues of race in a different way? Did you feel like it brought you a little further?
Yeah, I think it brought me a little further. I think it helped me think about them and
I think what's interesting about implicit bias is I have struggles with it. Because I'm a former civil rights lawyer, so intentional discrimination is our bread and butter, and how you prove things and how you actually get to a remedy. The implicit bias research is not necessarily inconsistent, but it is a softer touch in trying to understand what's going on with race. But it is particularly helpful in certain scenarios, right? If you're dealing with a police department, implicit bias really comes into play, because every time they engage with a person of color that is not their color, you may be seeing the impact of implicit bias. And just to give you a brief, I don't want to go into implicit bias today, but basically, our brain works with schemas. And so since, you came out of the womb, you've been developing these schemas. And it's really like, I think about it like a catalog. Like if your first association with a certain group of color is through the media, you are certainly going to have certain impressions about those folks, right? If you have some difficulty with somebody, that gets put into the catalog. And you may be thinking things, even though you don't think you're thinking things. It's unconscious. And the research is, when you really get into the research, it's amazing. You're like, I cannot believe that is true. If you haven't done it, Harvard has the implicit bias test that you can take online. And I hate taking it because I think I'm very progressive, and I think I'm very careful about issues of race. But when you take it, you find out you have biases, right? And you just don't think you do, but you actually do. This triangle, for instance, how many of you are actually seeing a full triangle here? Most of you, right? But of course, if you look super close at it, there is no full triangle. So what your body is doing, what your brain is doing with implicit bias is filling in gaps. When you don't have all the information, you don't know what somebody's educational background is, you don't know where they live, you fill in the gaps based on what you think you know or what has been recorded in your brain. It's really powerful. But it's a new tool that we're seeing having value with lots of organizations who want to embrace this topic. It is a resource that we can bring to the war on poverty, right? It's something new. And now I want to shift a little bit from the race discussion about the war on poverty and talk about the intergenerational pieces of it. You already answered one question at the very beginning, that only 2 of you from the Pilley group knew about the war on poverty or ever learned about it in school, okay? So clearly, why you do the work and the folks that were inspired by the war on poverty may be completely different, right? They may have some relationship to each other, but your motivations may be very different. So let me just, why do you do this work? I'm going to randomly call on somebody. How about you right in front? Why do you do this work? Why do you do public interest work?
Because there's a great need and because I personally feel like I came from
I'm going to tell you that if you asked that question with a group that had older persons in it, they would also add, because I was part of a movement. I actually wanted to change what was going on in America. And you may want that too, but it's at different degrees. And how you engage with the work is very different than how, or can be very different than how other generations engage with the work. Did you want to raise your hand?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, I think that, I was just gonna add to that, like, I think this goes with the movement, like personal connection to people that are living in conditions or that's, I think, what probably motivates a lot of us. Like a couple people mentioned their own experience. I think that I had that same experience.
So there's some aspect of the movement that you feel, is what you're saying. So do you think that you, as you know, there's always this talk about millennials need more feedback, right? Millennials are more difficult to supervise. You hear that all the time, right? You hear that?
You may not.
Okay, well, if people are saying, okay? Right? You didn't know, that's what they're saying, okay? And I push back against that. I think our organization is very interested in making sure that this work continues, and we are pushing back against that because just because you may work in a different way doesn't mean the work is less valuable. And one of the ways that shows up, these are not showing up real well, but you know, they always say that the Generation X and Generation Y need more feedback. You really have to feel a connection to the work. You need to engage with people. You just can't be policy wonks. So there's all these different things and all these different categories around how people are different in these lists, right? And of course they're not across the board the same or exactly right all the time. There's always going to be deviation. But the question are our organizations doing well to pull you in and engage you, right? You also face different issues. You face a different job market. You face different debt. You know, there's this concept in legal aid community about you need to be committed for life to do this work, right? Like you can't come in and out of it. That is something that I personally have one of the biggest struggles with, right? I think people could do great work for 5 years, right? But then maybe go back into private practice because they need the money or they like private practice, right? I don't think it's this absolute system where you have to be over here or over there. There's a lot of stuff in the middle. And I don't think our organizations are doing enough to really accept that and encourage it or work with it. I'm interested in just talking a little bit more about the intergenerational pieces. Let's be very specific. In terms of supervision, you know, I would say that if you're older than I am, you like to be left alone. That's what the chart says. Like you don't want people engaging with you, talking with you. You got it. You don't want to have any sort of interaction. I think if you're younger than me, you kind of want more feedback and guidance, or you want to know what's going on. Is that true? Do you feel like you need that more than you see some of the older folks that you work with? You have your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I was actually just telling that I was disappointed that, you know, the fact that I wasn't getting feedback from some of my supervisors. No feedback is a good thing. Like, you shouldn't expect feedback. Like, just because you don't get feedback doesn't mean that you're doing something wrong.
You know, and I push back against that because what's wrong with actually giving you feedback, right? I may actually learn something in the process about the product that you're putting out or that we're as an organization putting out. It is not, to me, okay to say, she's different, I'm this way. You have to adjust to the way I am because I'm the boss, right? I think that's not a good business practice, and I think it actually will cause a break in the war on poverty because I think you're going to push out people who may like the work but don't have the other things that they need actually to keep going. and I just want to tie it back up and bring it back to some of the work that we do. We've talked about racial justice, we've talked about intergenerational things. We had a pregnancy bill this year in the Illinois House, in the legislature, where our advocacy, along with others across the state, actually led to, I don't know if you know this or not, but if you're pregnant and you need to rest during the day, or you need to keep a water bottle with you, there's nothing in the law currently that says that has to happen, right? So now in Illinois, which is shocking, I know it's like a reasonable accommodation, you think that exists, but it's not in the law. There's been some recent things in the Supreme Court, but we've actually passed, working with others, an accommodation bill that provides for that. That's an example of the work that we do. That is not necessarily racial justice focused, it's not generational focused, that's just work that needs to be done, right? So we do a whole slew of things like that. We also do work on ban the box, making sure that if you have a criminal record that is minor, that is not interfering with your employment, that question does not get asked until you are actually in the interview stage, instead of it being a screen out. That's huge, and that's an example of having racial impact. You can do it two ways. You can do a race-neutral policy that has race impact, right? That's ban the box, right? The law is one thing, but because of the disproportionate numbers around race, it's going to have a larger impact for our community. So that's another example. And then we have racially explicit work, our education equity work, where we are specifically saying that by race, students are not having the same resources and access. So it can be a mix of things that can bring your work forward into the next generation of war on poverty. But it needs to be deliberate. You need to be thinking about, am I incorporating this? How am I incorporating it? Maybe race neutral is the best way here. Maybe implicit bias is the best way here. Maybe an actual intent discrimination case is the best way over here. But the policy work can take these different forms. And when I say policy work, just to go back to what Katie introduced me to say, we do have direct service clients. In our housing and our community justice area, which is really criminal justice plus some things. But we also take that work from on the ground and use it in the type of legislation that we would try to promote or fight against. And then once we've done that here in Illinois, we disseminate that to other folks in other places. So our policy work really is about following the regs. It is supporting good legislation like the ACA, the Affordable Care Act. We were proponents for years for healthcare and of course supported ACA and continue to do that, and there's a ton of policy work all behind that. So the information comes from folks, community organizations that we work with, our own touches with the community, and then taking that information and using it so that the regs make sense, so that there is a broad-based level of people who are actually enrolling in the program. So our advocacy work is broad. It isn't just one thing. It is a lot of things, and it sometimes stems from direct client services and sometimes it doesn't. We are also starting something called Focus 50, which some of you may have been invited to. We had the first one last week, and essentially what it is talking about different issues about the war on poverty with different segments of the society. So last week was with law students, with your peer group, some of you were there. It was a small discussion, but it was just trying to talk about, do you use the word poverty? Do you use the word low income? Because that changes, right? I think certain people want to use poor, some people don't want to use poor, and do we understand why that happens? Because that's about taking the work forward, right? If we're using old terminology from 50 years ago because that's academic and that's what it should be, but it's not resonating with somebody, that's a problem. And there are organizations like the Center for American Progress that do that on a national level. There are several groups, and we're part of that conversation about, are we smart about how we do anti-poverty work? Are we actually taking what we know about marketing and using it in the work that we do? So that's also a role that the Shriver Center plays. And these small groups, these Focus 50s are really what we're trying to do. We've done the law student one, but we hope to do that with different sectors. So with people who are in firms and have been in firms for 10 to 15 years would be another segment. Just taking segments of our society and actually trying to sit down and have a conversation about how do you think about poverty now? Because if we understand that better, we can actually take the work forward. I think that's pretty much all I have for the presentation, but I'm happy to answer questions or just continue
This is an
to.
opportunity to, sorry, Carol. This is an opportunity to ask about the job of being, being in this type of law. If you have recommendations, maybe or this type of law specifically. Yeah.
I think that people, I think there's this misperception that you have to always stay within public interest to get a public interest job. And I would say people should think more broadly about that and think about skills. I think that it's good to have litigation skills, even at a policy take, right? Because it actually helps how you think and you actually can connect to the people on the ground. So I would say don't be as limited in what you think about in terms of a public interest background. I think people are looking for good skills. And I think you always have to be involved with organizations that are doing public interest work, but that's a separate question from developing skills. I think there's an avoidance, I'm not exactly sure why, of clerkships in public interest. And I know that there are people have different thoughts about that. People say your resume has to be full of all public interest, nobody's interested in you clerking. I think that's crazy. I think some of the best experience you can get is from clerking. And I know I'm saying something that other people have heard different advice about. This is not, my experience working with interns for the last many years, but the last 2 in public interest is nobody's interested in the clerkships. And it doesn't make any sense to me. I would say advice-wise, skills, and having some involvement with public interest consistently. Is that what you're looking for, Katie? Or
or maybe like an ideal candidate for an intern or new hire.
Somebody who's got good skills, somebody who can, if we need to litigate, can litigate. Somebody who has written well, in some way can show that. And I think knowing something, right? Like being able to come into an interview and actually talk about what you learned. We had a candidate for fellowship who had done an internship, I won't say what the area was, but when he came out of his interview, we all said, man, it sounds like he's been doing that a long time. He'd mastered the lingo of his specialty. And of course you're gonna get more and more into that, but there was something, he stood out because he actually, you could see him as an advocate, right? And I also always tell people, nobody wants to work with somebody they don't like. I know people don't like, people want to say it's all my credentials that I'm putting forward. But at the end of the day, if you don't have some kind of connection with somebody, and that doesn't mean you have to love them, but, if you sit down and are like, my GPA is this and this, you have to advocate for yourself, but I want to know what kind of human being you are too, right? So I would also say, don't forget that piece. And when you're interning, don't forget that piece, right? Because people are watching you, right? And observing you. And if you are always, there's one thing about being an advocate. If you're taking a position because you think it's going to actually help clients, that's one thing. But if you're taking a position to be contrary, or if you look at the big picture of it, like that's really not the major thing we need to be concerned about. It's that judgment that people are looking for. Because you can't, even if you want to engage in feedback, you can't be everywhere all the time. You want to know that people have good judgment. I think I can say for the Schreiber Center, when we're looking at interns and fellows, in the rare instance that we would hire young lawyers because we have a small staff, I think it's those knowing an area or really getting how the advocates talk about something.
So many of us are affiliated with law firms, and you mentioned that it's important if you do things that you might want to. Directions you need just like sitting on boards or seeking out the pro bono opportunity.
I think both of those things. I think it's like genuine, honest interest in something, right? Like you have an interest in women policy issues. So I can look at your resume and go, yeah, you worked at a private firm for 10 years, but she always was working some way around these issues and clearly has some interest in that, even though she was working at a firm or because she was working at a firm, right? So that's what, it could be sitting on an associate board. It could be taking about a pro bono case where you represent somebody. It could be, you know, just connecting with the advocates in that area, right? You know, do you know who the folks are? I'm just using women in policy as an example. Have you gone and had informational interviews with them? Do you go to the events that they sponsor, right? You know, those don't always have a charge, you know, it might be a discussion. Do you go to those things and engage in it? So it's not, I don't think there's just one thing, but I think showing, you know, I've seen a couple of people who've made the transition recently, and well, not necessarily at the Shriver Center, but in talking with them, and they showed that interest in public interest some way, somehow, over the course of their private practice career. And so it wasn't far-fetched for them to want to go back into public interest.
Carol and I talked about how it's a little different when you're a fellow and when you're in a policy organization about engaging you as a pro bono volunteer and attorney. But what's important is to be really informed member of the bar here in Illinois about the type of legislation that's being put out and the regulations and the advocacy kind of issues that are surrounding the community. And so short of being a pro bono volunteer, which isn't always available in advocacy and very informed person, and they're a great resource as other legislation policy.
Yeah, and I think what Katie is talking about is, you know, it's not, since we don't have a ton of direct services cases, it's hard for us to call and say we need some folks pro bono for this. We have large scale issues that we work on for multiple years, so it's very hard for somebody to just come in and pitch in on that. Very, very difficult. And so our pro bono opportunities are not maybe as expansive as some direct service organizations. So it will be harder to actually work with us, but you can still learn about an issue and you can still bring your firm resources. We often need research. You know, that may not be as sexy as client stuff, but if you want to do research for a policy organization and you can manage your conflicts, that is very welcome. You know, so I think you got to think out of the box, but developing relationships with folks, I think, is probably the key.
Other questions?
I just want to ask kind of a specific question. So we talked a little bit about how to prepare yourself to be like a public interest attorney, even for a short period of time, getting the skills necessary. What about specifically being like a policy, like an attorney who engages in policy later on? So it sounds like that's kind of not something that you start off with out of law school, but something maybe that you work to. Any suggestions that you have for, other than like going on for clerkships or like about like first and maybe second jobs that can kind of gear you into that?
You know, so if you talk to all the different advocates at the Shriver Center, every path is different. I mean, and we don't have any of our summer interns here, but I think that shocked them all, right? Like I don't know what they assumed everybody had done. We have people that stopped off in private practice, the first public defender's office, LAF. We have a lot of people who started at LAF. There just isn't one path. I don't know how to answer that question. At our shop, there just isn't one path. You know, Justice Kilbride is also a good example of that. His background is varied, you know, and I think that makes him a better justice, right? You know, it's like, I don't know, there's not a straight line sometimes, you know, you can deviate. I think it's authenticity as you do it that makes the difference.
Guys, and thank you so much again.
Sure,
yeah,
no problem.
I appreciate it. All right, this is the last session, so please take any pop that you want, any of the food, any of the calendars, the layout information, Jamba Juice coupons, all of that. And I hope to see you guys on Thursday if you're available.